I'll be honest. I thought I knew exactly who Daniel was until the night I found a second phone hidden in his car. For 3 years, our relationship felt stable in the kind of way people quietly envy. We lived together in Chicago, shared bills, shared routines, shared the same friends, and slowly built a life that looked completely normal from the outside. Daniel was organized, calm, reliable, and honestly, that was probably the reason I trusted him as much as I did. He never acted chaotic or suspicious. If anything, he was the type of man who always seemed in control of everything around him. That's why I ignored little things I probably should have questioned sooner. The late work trips, the random emotional distance, the fact that he guarded his phone a little too carefully sometimes. At the time, all of those things felt explainable because when you love someone long enough, your brain naturally starts protecting the relationship instead of investigating it. The night everything changed started completely normally. My last meeting at work got canceled, so I left earlier than expected and decided I'd surprise Daniel by picking him up instead of waiting for him to get me after work like he usually did on Fridays. Chicago was freezing that evening. The parking garage smelled like wet concrete and cold air, and I remember walking toward his car thinking about dinner and whether we should order Thai food or pizza later that night. It's strange how your entire life can split into a before and after moment without warning. The first thing that felt strange was the fact that his car was unlocked. Daniel never left his car unlocked. I know that sounds small, but when you live with someone for years, you memorize their habits automatically. Daniel locked everything. His car, his laptop, the apartment door, even when he was only running downstairs for 2 minutes. At first, I brushed it off and assumed he forgot. Then I opened the passenger door and got inside. Everything looked normal at first. His gym bag was in the back seat. Receipts were stuffed into the cup holder like always, and his jacket was thrown across the seat exactly the way he usually left it. Nothing looked suspicious until I noticed something black partially hidden between the passenger seat and the center console. At first, I honestly thought someone dropped it accidentally. I leaned down and pulled it out. A phone. Black case. Clean screen. No cracks. No fingerprints. Not his. I knew that immediately because Daniel's actual phone always looked destroyed. The case was scratched, the screen protector was cracked, and he constantly complained about dropping it. This phone looked almost brand new. I turned it over in my hand and pressed the side button. The lock screen lit up. No wallpaper. No notifications. No name. Just a plain lock screen. I remember staring at it for a second while this weird feeling slowly started building in my chest, because nothing about it felt casual anymore. The phone wasn't sitting out in the open like someone forgot it. It looked hidden, like whoever put it there didn't want it noticed. I should have put it back. Instead, I kept holding it. A few seconds later, the screen lit up from an incoming message. "Are you still coming tonight?" That single sentence changed everything instantly, because it didn't sound casual. It sounded personal, planned, like the kind of message you send someone you fully expect to see later. I kept staring at the screen while my brain desperately tried to come up with explanations that didn't completely destroy the last 3 years of my life. Maybe it belonged to a coworker. Maybe Daniel was helping someone with something. Maybe there was still a normal explanation. Then I looked toward the driver's side door pocket. And that's where I saw Daniel's actual phone. I still remember how cold my body felt in that moment because suddenly this wasn't confusion anymore. There were two phones. One sitting openly where it belonged, and another one hidden beside my seat. That's when I realized this wasn't accidental. It was intentional. The second phone buzzed again in my hand. "Don't ignore me again. I saw you with her." My stomach dropped immediately. With her. Not with another girl. Not with someone. With her. Me. Whoever sent that message knew I existed. And suddenly the situation stopped feeling like possible cheating and started feeling much bigger than that because whoever was texting him had clearly seen us together recently enough to recognize me. I sat frozen in the passenger seat while my thoughts spiraled completely out of control. 10 minutes earlier, I had been thinking about dinner plans, and now I was holding evidence that the man I lived with had another phone connected to another life I knew nothing about. Then the phone buzzed again. "Are you with her right now?" That message hit differently because it sounded emotional. Hurt. Suspicious. Like this wasn't some random affair hidden from both sides. This sounded like another relationship. I leaned back slowly against the seat and tried breathing normally while panic crawled through my chest. Part of me wanted to put the phone back exactly where I found it and pretend none of this happened until I had time to think clearly. Another part of me needed answers immediately. That's when I did something I normally never would have done. I tried unlocking the phone. At first, Face ID failed. Then unexpectedly, it opened. I froze. For a second, I genuinely thought I imagined it, but the home screen was already sitting right in front of me. And honestly, that realization disturbed me more than the messages. The phone recognized my face. Not because it belonged to me. Not because Daniel gave me access. But because he had apparently used this hidden phone around me often enough for the system to recognize me as familiar. That meant this secret part of his life had existed physically close to me for a long time without me ever noticing it. The Messages app was already open when the phone unlocked, and the conversation stretched back for months. Dinner reservations, flight confirmations, photos, arguments, apologies, promises. The deeper I scrolled, the worse the feeling in my chest became because nothing about this looked casual. It looked serious, real. And before I could decide whether I even wanted to keep reading, another message appeared at the bottom of the screen. Just don't lie to me again. That line hit me harder than everything else because it didn't sound angry. It sounded exhausted. Like whoever this woman was, she'd already been hurt by him before. That's when I realized something that honestly made me feel sick. I wasn't looking at another woman trying to steal my boyfriend. I was probably looking at another woman being lied to by the exact same man. My own phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. Daniel, where are you? The timing made my heart start racing again. I stared at the message for several seconds before slowly looking back down at the second phone in my lap. And somewhere in that moment, I realized I had two choices. I could confront him immediately and probably hear another perfectly polished lie. Or I could find out how deep this actually went first. So instead of calling him, I opened the hidden conversation again and typed the one question that changed everything. Who is this? The message sat there on the screen for a few seconds before the typing dots appeared, then disappeared, then came back again. Whoever was on the other side clearly realized something was wrong. Finally, a reply came through. Don't do this. I frowned immediately because that wasn't confusion. It sounded like recognition, like she already knew the person typing wasn't Daniel anymore. I typed back carefully. Do what? This time the response came faster. You're not him. My stomach tightened again. I stared at the screen trying to understand how she figured it out so quickly. Maybe it was the wording. Maybe it was timing. Or maybe Daniel had done this before and she already recognized the feeling when something shifted. For a second, I thought about pretending to be him anyway, but honestly, I was too emotionally exhausted already to play games. So I typed the truth. No. There was another pause before the next message appeared. Who are you? I remember staring at that question longer than I should have because suddenly I didn't even know how to answer it myself anymore. Girlfriend? Victim? One of several? Finally, I typed the only thing that felt honest. I think I'm the girl he's been lying to. The message showed as delivered. A few seconds passed. Then her response came through. Which one? I swear that sentence hit harder than everything else so far. Because there was no confusion in it. No denial. No shock. Just quiet acceptance. Like this wasn't new information to her anymore. I leaned back slowly against the seat while my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. Up until that moment, part of me still wanted to believe this was isolated somehow. One affair. One mistake. One secret relationship. But that sentence destroyed all of those possibilities instantly. Which one? Plural. I swallowed hard and typed back. The one in Chicago. This time the pause lasted longer. Then finally. Oh, that was it. Just one word. But somehow it felt devastating because it meant she understood immediately. No explanation needed. Then another message appeared. I'm in Denver. Different city. Same man. Same lie. I closed my eyes for a second because suddenly the last 3 years of my relationship started rearranging themselves inside my head. All the work trips, all the flights, the random distance that appeared whenever he traveled, the carefully timed calls. I had spent years believing Daniel traveled constantly for consulting work. Now I wasn't even sure he had the job he claimed to have. How long? I typed carefully. Almost a year. A year. I looked down at my hands gripping the phone. Daniel and I had been together for 3 years already, which meant this wasn't new. This wasn't impulsive. This was something sustained and carefully maintained over time. What about you? She asked. 3 years. Another long pause followed. Then, wow. Yeah, wow. I sat there in silence for a second, staring through the windshield at the empty parking garage, while reality slowly settled heavier onto my chest. Two women in different cities connected by the same man and the same lies. Then another thought hit me. Do you know my name? I asked. He told me your name is Emily. That made my stomach turn immediately. He had told her about me. Not hidden me completely. Just rewritten me into something more convenient. What did he say I was? This time her response took longer. He said you were his ex. I actually laughed out loud when I read that, but it didn't sound normal. It sounded hollow and exhausted. Of course. Of course I was the ex. Not current. Not real. Just some leftover part of his past. That's not true, I typed. I know, she replied almost immediately. That answer hit hard because it meant she already suspected him before tonight. Then another message came through. I saw you together. I stared at the screen. You saw us where? At a restaurant. 2 weeks ago. The memory came back instantly. Daniel and I had gone downtown after he returned from what he claimed was another work trip. I remembered him checking his phone constantly during dinner and acting distracted the entire night. At the time, I convinced myself he was stressed from work. Now I realized another woman had probably been sitting somewhere nearby watching us together while realizing she'd been lied to too. The thought made me feel sick. Then she sent another message. There's something you need to know. Every muscle in my body tightened immediately. What? He's supposed to be here tonight. I frowned. What do you mean? In Denver, she replied. Dinner at 7:30. I looked automatically at the dashboard clock. 6:24 p.m. My stomach dropped. That was impossible. Daniel had just texted me. His car was sitting here. His actual phone was beside me. How could he possibly be in Denver within an hour? That can't be right, I typed quickly. He's in Chicago. The response came immediately. No, he isn't. I stared at the screen while panic crawled slowly through my chest because suddenly this situation didn't just feel emotionally confusing anymore. It didn't make physical sense. One of us had to be wrong. Unless Daniel wasn't where either of us thought he was. I grabbed my own phone and opened our conversation. Are you still at work? The typing dots appeared almost instantly. Just left. Why? Too fast. Way too fast. Like he was prepared for the question already. I slowly looked around the car again, trying to think clearly for the first time since this started. Then something hit me. The car. Daniel always drove to work. Always. So why was his car still sitting in the garage? My heartbeat sped up immediately as I looked toward the back seat more carefully. That's when I noticed another jacket hanging behind the driver's seat. Not his usual one. Different style. Cleaner. Sharper. Like it belonged to another version of him entirely. The second phone buzzed again. You still there? I stared at the message before typing back slowly. I think I'm starting to realize I don't actually know him at all. This time her response came immediately. Yeah, she wrote. That feeling gets worse. I kept staring at her last message while my thoughts spiraled completely out of control. That feeling gets worse. There was something about the way she said it that bothered me more than the actual words. She didn't sound dramatic or emotional anymore. She sounded tired, like she'd already spent months trying to make sense of someone who never fully made sense. My phone buzzed again. Daniel, why are you at my car? I looked down at the message and immediately noticed what was missing. He never answered my question about work. He ignored it completely. Instead, he wanted to know where I was. That realization changed something in my head instantly because suddenly I wasn't looking at him like a boyfriend anymore. I was looking at him like someone trying to regain control of a situation before it slipped too far away from him. I typed back carefully. I told you. Come get me. This time there was no instant reply. No typing dots. Nothing. And somehow, that silence felt louder than everything else. The second phone buzzed again in my hand. Did he answer? She asked. Not really, I typed. He ignored my question. Another pause. Then, he always does that. I frowned. What do you mean? He answers the part that helps him, she replied. Not the part you actually asked. I stared at the message for a second because she was right. Daniel did that constantly. Not just now. Always. I suddenly remembered arguments we'd had over the years where I walked away somehow feeling confused instead of resolved. Every conversation with him somehow shifted direction without me realizing it until afterward. At the time, I thought he was just calm under pressure. Now I was starting to wonder if he was simply practiced. My chest tightened again. How long have you known something was off? I asked her. The response took longer this time. Honestly, almost from the beginning. That surprised me. Then why stay? There was a long pause before she answered. Because every time I almost walked away, he somehow convinced me I was overthinking everything. I leaned back slowly in the seat because that answer hit uncomfortably close to home. Daniel was very good at making doubt feel irrational. Anytime I questioned something, he'd respond so calmly and logically that eventually I'd feel guilty for even bringing it up. He never yelled. Never got defensive. He just redirected conversations so smoothly that I'd end up apologizing instead. At the time, I thought that meant he was emotionally mature. Now I wasn't so sure. The second phone buzzed again. There's something else you should know. Every message somehow made my stomach tighter. What? I have a key to his apartment here. I froze immediately. What apartment? In Denver. I stared at the screen while my heartbeat sped up again. Apartment. Not hotel. Not temporary rental. Apartment. A permanent setup. How long has he had it? At least since I met him. Everything inside me went cold. Because now this wasn't just cheating during work trips anymore. This was infrastructure. Multiple locations. Multiple lives carefully built over time. Without even thinking about it, I typed. Can you go there? There was hesitation before her response appeared. Right now? Yes. Another pause. Then finally. Okay. I sat there gripping both phones while waiting for updates, and during those next few minutes, my anxiety got so bad I genuinely thought I might pass out. Daniel texted again. Emily, answer me. Then another one. Where exactly are you parked? I ignored both. For the first time in 3 years, I realized Daniel sounded nervous. Not worried. Not confused. Nervous. Like something inside his carefully controlled system had suddenly gone wrong. The second phone buzzed again. Photo incoming. I opened it immediately. And the second I saw the apartment, my entire body went numb. It didn't look lived in. It looked staged. The furniture was minimal and generic, like something from a model apartment nobody actually used. The kitchen counters were almost empty. There were no personal photos anywhere, and everything looked strangely untouched. Clean. Controlled. Temporary. Another photo came through. The bedroom. My stomach dropped again. The closet was barely filled, but the clothes hanging inside weren't even Daniel's normal style. Different jackets. Different shoes. Different watches. Like another version of him lived there. Another identity. Another performance. I zoomed in on the picture while this horrible realization slowly settled in my chest. This apartment wasn't a home. It was a set. A place designed to support another version of his life whenever he needed it. Then another message appeared beneath the photos. This place feels fake. I swallowed hard. Because she was right. Nothing about it felt personal. It felt operational. Like he built environments instead of relationships. Then one more message came through. Emily. I don't think we're the only ones. I stared at the screen for several seconds while cold panic slowly spread through my chest again. At first, I thought she meant another affair. Another woman somewhere. But deep down, I already knew this was bigger than that. People don't accidentally build systems this complicated for only two relationships. They refine them, expand them, repeat them. How many? I typed slowly. I don't know, she admitted. But I've seen at least one more. My grip tightened around the phone. One more. Maybe more than that, she replied. I just know about one for sure. I leaned forward, elbows resting against the steering wheel while my brain tried desperately to process what I was hearing. How did you find out? I wasn't supposed to be in Phoenix that weekend, she wrote. My flight got delayed, and I saw him with another woman at a hotel. Phoenix. Different city again. Different woman. Different life. I closed my eyes for a second because suddenly Daniel's entire existence started feeling artificial. Like every city held another hidden version of him. What did she look like? I asked. Different from us, she replied. Older. Different style. Different life. That detail stayed with me. Different. Not a pattern of attraction. A pattern of roles. Like he built different identities for different environments. My own phone buzzed again. Daniel calling. I stared at the screen while my heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up this time. Because suddenly I wasn't panicking anymore. I was starting to understand him. And honestly, that felt even worse. The call kept ringing, then finally stopped. A second later, another text appeared. I'm coming now. Stay there. Of course. Stay. Wait. Don't move around. Don't discover more. I looked toward the entrance of the parking garage while a horrible realization settled into my chest. This wasn't a man juggling relationships because he fell in love too easily. This was someone managing people. Carefully. Systematically. And somehow, I had just broken the schedule he depended on to keep everything hidden. I stared at Daniel's last message while my thoughts kept circling the same realization over and over again. This wasn't chaos. It only looked chaotic from the outside. Underneath everything, there was structure. Schedules. Cities. Apartments. Different women living inside different versions of his life without ever fully overlapping. And somehow, I had accidentally stepped outside the version of reality he created for me. The second phone buzzed again. Do you think he knows? She asked. I looked down at the message for a second before answering. Not yet. But honestly, I wasn't completely sure anymore. Because Daniel sounded different now. Careful. Controlled. Almost too controlled. Like he was trying very hard not to sound nervous. Then another message appeared from her. What are you going to do? That question sat heavier in my chest than I expected because the truth was, I had no idea anymore. An hour earlier, I thought I was in a stable relationship. Now I was sitting in my boyfriend's car holding evidence that he had multiple secret lives in multiple cities, and somehow that still didn't feel like the full story yet. Before I could answer her, headlights appeared near the entrance of the garage. A black SUV slowly turned the corner. My stomach tightened immediately. Daniel. I recognized the car instantly even though I'd never seen it before. That alone made my chest tighten again, because now I understood why his actual car was still sitting here untouched. He hadn't driven it today, which meant whatever version of himself left for work this morning probably left in that SUV instead. The vehicle pulled closer before parking 2 rows ahead of me. The driver's door opened, and there he was. Same face, same calm expression, same confident walk, like nothing was wrong. Like my entire reality hadn't completely collapsed in the last 40 minutes. I quickly locked the second phone and slid it back exactly where I found it before stepping out of the passenger seat. Daniel looked relieved the second he saw me standing there. That bothered me immediately. Not happy. Relieved. Hey, he said casually while walking closer. You okay? I studied his face carefully for the first time in years. And suddenly I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way his eyes scanned the car before fully looking at me. The tiny tension in his jaw. The fact that his first instinct was to assess the situation before reacting emotionally. I'm fine, I said calmly. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he glanced toward his car again. You scared me a little, he said with a small laugh. I wasn't expecting you here. That line sounded so normal that another version of me probably would have believed it instantly. but now every sentence coming out of his mouth felt calculated. I wanted to surprise you, I replied. You definitely did, he said. Still calm. Still smiling. Still trying to figure out how much I knew. He reached for the driver's door. I'll drive, he said quickly. Of course. Control again. I stepped aside without arguing and walked around to the passenger seat while he got inside. The second I sat down beside him, the entire atmosphere in the car felt different. Not because of him. Because of me. I could still feel the hidden phone sitting inches away from my leg, and suddenly every movement Daniel made felt strange to watch. He started the engine and looked over at me. So, where do you want to go? I stared out through the windshield for a second before answering. Take me somewhere you haven't taken anyone else. His hand paused slightly against the steering wheel. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. And that tiny reaction told me more than any confession could have. What does that mean? He asked carefully. I turned toward him slowly. Exactly what I said. For the first time since arriving, his smile faded slightly. Not completely. Just enough. He looked back toward the road and started driving out of the garage in silence. No music. No small talk. Nothing except the sound of traffic and the feeling of him thinking beside me. Calculating. Adjusting. Trying to decide what version of himself he needed to become next. You're acting weird, he said finally. That line almost made me laugh. Weird. As if finding a hidden second phone in his car should lead to normal behavior. I know, I replied calmly. Another silence followed. Then he glanced at me briefly. Did something happen at work? There it was. Fishing. Trying to identify the source of the problem without directly asking. I leaned back against the seat and looked out the window. No, I said quietly. I think something happened a lot earlier than that. That landed. I saw it immediately in the way his grip tightened slightly against the steering wheel. Not panic. Recognition. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. A few minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of a small diner I'd never seen before. That detail mattered immediately. Neutral location. No emotional history attached to it. No risk of running into someone. Even now, he was managing the environment. We went inside and sat across from each other in a quiet booth near the back corner. A waitress came over, took our order, and left again, leaving this heavy silence sitting between us. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Okay, he said calmly. What's going on? I looked at him for several seconds before answering. Do you want the short version or the truth? That finally broke something in his expression. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see it. Emily. I know about the second phone, I interrupted quietly. Silence. No denial. No confusion. Nothing. That alone told me everything. I know about Denver too, I added. His eyes flickered slightly at that one. Fast. Controlled. But real. And I know there are other women. The silence after that felt endless. Daniel leaned back slowly in the booth and exhaled through his nose while staring down at the table. For the first time all night, he stopped performing. No fake confusion. No quick explanations. No immediate lies. Just silence. Then finally, he looked back at me. You weren't supposed to find out like this, he said quietly. I almost laughed again because somehow that response felt even worse than denial. Not, this isn't true. Not, you're misunderstanding. Just regret about the timing. How many? I asked. He looked away for a second before answering. I honestly don't know anymore. My chest tightened immediately. You don't know? Not exactly, he replied carefully. I stared at him across the table while this horrible realization slowly settled into my stomach. He wasn't talking like someone who accidentally cheated. He was talking like someone managing a system that got too large to track emotionally anymore. And deep down, I realized the worst part wasn't that Daniel lied to people. It was that he'd been doing it long enough to become comfortable inside it. I kept staring at Daniel after he said it. I honestly don't know anymore. The scary part wasn't the answer itself. It was how calm he sounded while saying it. Like he wasn't admitting to destroying multiple people emotionally. Like we were discussing work schedules or business problems instead of years of manipulation. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The diner around us suddenly felt strangely loud, plates clattering somewhere in the background while a couple near the counter laughed about something completely unrelated to the moment that was quietly destroying my life. I looked at Daniel and realized something I probably should have understood years ago. He wasn't nervous because he felt guilty. He was nervous because he lost control of the situation. That's different. Very different. You don't even know how many women there are? I asked quietly. He rubbed one hand across his jaw before answering. It's not like that. I almost smiled at that because somehow every manipulative person says the exact same thing eventually. It's not like that. As if wording changes reality. Then explain it to me, I said calmly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like that. Daniel leaned back slightly and glanced around the diner for a second before looking at me again. I never planned for things to become this complicated, he said. That sentence irritated me immediately because it still sounded like he was describing logistics instead of people. Complicated. Like we were scheduling problems. Not human beings. You had apartments in different cities, I said. That doesn't happen accidentally. His expression tightened slightly. So I kept going. You told another woman I was your ex. You had a second phone hidden in your car. You built completely different lives for different people, and somehow you still want this to sound unintentional? For the first time all night, Daniel looked genuinely tired. Not emotional. Just tired. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. You're looking at this emotionally, he said quietly. I look at it structurally. I stared at him. What does that even mean? He hesitated for a second before answering. It means I stopped seeing relationships the way other people do a long time ago. That answer sat heavily between us. Not because it sounded deep, because it sounded practiced. Like he'd explained this to himself many times before. I folded my arms slowly across my chest. So, what are people to you then? He held my gaze for a few seconds before answering. Different parts of my life. That wasn't an answer. It was avoidance again. And suddenly I realized something important. Daniel never directly answered emotional questions. Ever. He redirected them, reframed them, turned them abstract. Even now, you're talking about people like their environments, I said quietly. He looked down at the table for a second. Then finally, for the first time all night, he said something honest. Because one person can't be everything forever. I felt my stomach tighten again. There it was. The real belief underneath all of this. Not love. Not attachment. Consumption. Constant emotional variety. Different versions of himself reflected back through different people. And instead of leaving relationships when you got bored, I said slowly, you just created new ones. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. The waitress came over with our food, and the timing honestly felt surreal. She placed the plates down with a smile while neither of us touched them. The second she walked away, I looked back at him. How many cities? I asked. That question finally seemed to affect him. His eyes narrowed slightly. Emily. How many? Another pause. Then, 5. I actually stopped breathing for a second. 5. Chicago. Denver. Phoenix. And at least 2 more. 5 different versions of his life running at the same time. How did you even manage that? I asked quietly. Daniel gave a small shrug like the answer was obvious. Schedules. That single word made me feel sick. Schedules. Like all of us existed inside some rotating calendar system he perfected over time. Suddenly, every work trip made sense. Every delayed text. Every emotionally distant week followed by sudden affection. It wasn't random. It was management. I stared at him across the table and honestly felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing Daniel's face. Then another thought hit me. Do they all know about each other now? He looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. No, but some do. Silence. That was another yes. I leaned back slowly against the booth while exhaustion finally started replacing shock inside me. Because after a certain point, your brain physically stops processing betrayal normally. Everything becomes too big to hold emotionally at once. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since this conversation started. Did you ever actually love any of us? Daniel looked at me carefully for several seconds before answering. And honestly, I think that was the first fully truthful moment of the night. In different ways, he said quietly. That answer hurt more than if he'd simply said no. Because I believed him. I think he did feel attached to people. Just not enough to stop destroying them. That's the terrifying thing about people like Daniel. They aren't always emotionless monsters. Sometimes they genuinely care in fragments while still treating people like emotional resources. You need help, I said softly before I could stop myself. Daniel gave a small smile at that. Not offended. Not angry. Almost amused. Everyone says that eventually. That sentence made my chest tighten immediately. Everyone. Not just me. Not just Denver. Others. Enough others that he already recognized the pattern. I suddenly realized I was sitting across from a man who had probably repeated this exact conversation in different forms multiple times before. Same calm tone. Same controlled honesty. Same carefully measured vulnerability. And somehow, that realization hurt more than the cheating itself, because it meant even this moment wasn't unique. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly. I know you think I'm some kind of psychopath, he said quietly, but you have no idea how lonely it is living as one person for too long. I stared at him in disbelief. One person. Like stability itself felt suffocating to him. That's when it finally clicked completely. Daniel wasn't addicted to women. He was addicted to reinvention. Different cities gave him permission to become different versions of himself over and over again. And every woman he met became part of whichever identity he wanted to wear there. I looked down at the untouched food sitting between us before finally pushing my plate away. I can't do this anymore. For the first time that night, his calm expression cracked slightly. What does that mean? It means I'm done. The silence after that felt heavier than everything else combined. Because for the first time since this conversation started, Daniel realized he wasn't controlling where it ended anymore. Daniel kept staring at me after I said I was done, and for the first time that night, I could actually see uncertainty in him. Not panic. Not heartbreak. Just uncertainty. Like he genuinely didn't know what people were supposed to do once they stopped participating in the version of reality he built for them. You're serious, he said quietly. I almost laughed at that. Of course I was serious. I had just spent the last 2 hours discovering that the man I loved had apartments in multiple cities, separate phones, multiple relationships, and enough emotional control to manage all of it without collapsing under the pressure. But somehow, part of him still expected this conversation to be manageable, fixable, temporary. I don't really know what you expected to happen tonight, I said calmly. Daniel looked down at the table for a second before answering. I expected anger. That's because you still think this is just cheating. That landed harder than I expected. He looked back up at me slowly, and for the first time all evening, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Because cheating wasn't actually the thing destroying me anymore. It was the realization that almost every memory from the last 3 years now felt manipulated somehow. Every trip, every excuse, every perfectly timed apology, every moment where he somehow made me doubt my own instincts. I suddenly remembered all the times I caught myself feeling suspicious about something small, only for Daniel to calmly explain it away until I felt guilty for questioning him at all. At the time, I thought he was emotionally mature. Now I realized he was emotionally strategic. And honestly, that realization hurt worse than finding the second phone. Did you ever plan to stop? I asked quietly. Daniel leaned back slowly against the booth. I tried. That answer irritated me immediately. Tried. There were periods where I stayed in one place longer, he explained carefully. Periods where I thought I could simplify everything. Simplify. Again, the language sounded logistical instead of emotional. Like we were discussing scheduling systems instead of human beings. And then what? I asked. He gave a small shrug. I get restless. Restless. I stared at him in disbelief because his tone almost sounded frustrated with himself, like this entire situation was some exhausting habit he couldn't control. Then he said something that honestly chilled me. It's hard explaining this to people who only need one life. I felt something in my chest finally snap at that sentence. One life. Like normal relationships were limitations instead of commitments. Like stability itself felt unbearable to him. I shook my head slowly. You really don't hear yourself, do you? Daniel looked genuinely confused by that. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. He didn't think he was evil. That's what made him dangerous. People like Daniel almost never see themselves as villains because they explain their behavior through philosophy instead of consequences. In his mind, he wasn't destroying people emotionally. He was simply living differently than everyone else. That's why he could stay calm while admitting all of this. That's why he didn't seem ashamed. Then another thought hit me. What happens when women find out? I asked quietly. His expression shifted slightly. What do you mean? You've done this before, I said. So what happens? Daniel looked away for the first time since the conversation started. That alone told me enough. How many people have confronted you before me? He stayed silent. How many? Finally, he exhaled slowly. 3. My stomach turned immediately. 3. 3 women before me had already discovered pieces of this system, and somehow he still kept going. What did you tell them? That depends. On the person. On the situation. On which version of himself he needed to become. I could suddenly see the pattern so clearly it made me sick. Every confrontation probably became another psychological performance. Remorseful for some women. Confused for others. Emotional. Detached. Whatever worked best. Then something occurred to me that made my chest tighten again. Wait, the woman in Denver. Daniel looked at me carefully. What about her? She said this isn't the first time he disappeared on her. The second I said it out loud, his expression changed. Tiny. Quick. But real. And suddenly I understood. He didn't maintain perfect control over every relationship. He maintained just enough control to keep people uncertain. Enough confusion. Enough emotional attachment. Enough hope. That's why people stayed. That's why I stayed. I thought about all the moments I ignored because they didn't feel serious enough to end a relationship over. The delayed texts. The emotional distance. The strange inconsistencies. None of it felt big enough individually. That's how systems like this survive. Not through perfection. Through gradual normalization. I leaned back slowly and looked at him across the table. You know what the worst part is? Daniel stayed quiet. I still don't think this conversation is affecting you the same way it's affecting me. That was the first thing all night that seemed to genuinely bother him. His jaw tightened slightly before he answered. You think I don't care? I think you care differently. The silence after that felt heavy. Because deep down, I think he knew I was right. Then his phone buzzed against the table between us. For 1 second, both of us looked down at it. And I swear something changed inside me permanently in that moment. Because my first thought wasn't, who is texting him? It was, which life is calling right now? Daniel noticed my expression immediately. Slowly, he turned the phone face down. Too late. I'd already seen the notification. A woman's name. Not mine. Not Denver. Someone else. Another city. Another life. Another version. I looked back up at him while this exhausted clarity settled over me completely. And suddenly, for the first time all night, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Completely done. Because I finally understood something important. There was no winning against someone like Daniel. No perfect confrontation. No magical confession. No amount of love capable of fixing whatever emptiness made him build entire identities just to feel alive. People like him don't stop because they get caught. They stop when the performance stops working. And I finally realized I didn't want to be part of the audience anymore. Daniel kept his phone face down on the table after the notification appeared, but it didn't matter anymore. I'd already seen enough. Another woman. Another name I didn't recognize. Another reminder that this entire system was still active even while he sat across from me calmly explaining it. And honestly, that was the moment something inside me finally shut off emotionally. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly. Like my brain finally realized there was nothing left worth saving here. Daniel studied my face for a second before speaking again. You're looking at me differently now. I let out a small breath through my nose. That's because I finally see you clearly. He leaned back slightly, almost like he expected that answer. And maybe he did. Maybe this conversation had happened enough times before that parts of it already felt familiar to him. That thought alone made me feel exhausted. I stared down at the untouched food sitting between us, while my mind replayed the last 3 years differently now. Every memory suddenly had another layer underneath it, like I'd been watching the polished version of someone while the real person stayed hidden just out of reach. Then another realization hit me. You know what's scary? I said quietly. Daniel stayed silent. I still think part of you actually cared about me. That was the truth that bothered me most in the end. If he had been completely cold or obviously manipulative from the beginning, this would have been easier to process. But Daniel did care in his own distorted way. He remembered things about me, took care of me when I was sick, supported me through difficult moments, made me feel loved often enough that I built an entire future around him in my head. And somehow that made everything worse, because it meant none of this felt fake while I was living inside it. Daniel looked down at the table for a second before answering. I did care about you. Not past tense. Still present. Like he genuinely believed that should matter. I shook my head slowly. You don't even understand why that's horrifying. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely frustrated. You think everything was fake because you found out about the rest of it. The rest of it? I repeated quietly. Daniel, there are multiple women in multiple cities. He ran one hand slowly across his jaw. You're simplifying it. I actually laughed at that because the sentence sounded completely insane after everything he'd admitted already. Simplifying it? Yes, he said calmly. You're turning this into something shallow. I stared at him in disbelief. Shallow. Like secretly maintaining entire emotional relationships across the country was somehow philosophically deeper than normal commitment. Then he said something that honestly explained everything. You think identity is fixed, he said. I don't. There it was again. Not relationships. Identity. That was always the real addiction. Not women. Not attention. Reinvention. Different cities allowed him to become different versions of himself over and over again, and every relationship became another environment where he could perform a new identity. Chicago Daniel. Denver Daniel. Phoenix Daniel. Probably versions I still knew nothing about. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. I didn't actually know which version of him had been sitting across from me for the last 3 years. Maybe none of them were fully real. Maybe all of them were. I pushed my chair back slowly. I can't listen to this anymore. Daniel looked up immediately. So that's it? I grabbed my bag from the booth beside me. Yes. He watched me carefully for a second, and I could almost see him trying to calculate whether this was temporary anger or something permanent. That's the thing about people who control situations constantly. They struggle to understand finality. They always think there's another conversation coming. Another chance to reposition themselves emotionally. Another version of the story they can still sell. Emily, he said quietly, you're reacting emotionally right now. That sentence stopped me immediately. Not because it changed my mind, because it perfectly summarized everything wrong with him. I turned slowly back toward the table. Of course I'm reacting emotionally, I said. I'm a human being. The silence after that felt strangely heavy. Because for the first time all night, Daniel genuinely didn't seem to know what to say. I think part of him honestly believed emotional detachment made him more evolved somehow. Like staying calm while hurting people made him rational instead of damaged. But standing there looking at him, I finally understood something clearly. He wasn't above emotions. He was disconnected from them. There's a difference. And honestly, I think that disconnection was probably lonelier than he'd ever admit. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he looked down at the table and spoke quietly. You'll think about me differently after some time passes. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means right now you only see the damage. The damage. Again. Always abstract language. Never accountability. I stared at him for another few seconds before finally shaking my head. No, I said quietly. I think this is probably the clearest I've ever seen you. And for the first time all night, that answer actually hurt him. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But enough. I could see it in his eyes. Because suddenly there was no confusion left for him to manipulate anymore. No uncertainty. No emotional doorway back into my life. Just clarity. I turned and walked toward the exit before he could say anything else. The cold Chicago air hit my face the second I stepped outside, and honestly, it felt like waking up after being underwater too long. For a few seconds, I just stood there breathing, not crying, not panicking, just breathing. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The woman from Denver. Are you okay? I stared at the message for a second before replying. I think I finally am. Her response came a few seconds later. Did he lie? I looked back once through the diner window. Daniel was still sitting alone in the booth exactly where I left him, staring down at the table like he was already mentally reorganizing the pieces of his life again. Then I looked back at my phone. No, I typed slowly. That's the problem. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes after leaving the diner, staring through the windshield while downtown Chicago blurred into lights and reflections around me. The strange part was that I still hadn't cried. I thought I would. I thought I'd be screaming or shaking or calling friends in complete emotional collapse after discovering the man I loved had been secretly living multiple lives across different cities. But instead, I just felt empty. Not numb exactly. Clear. Like my brain finally stopped trying to protect the version of Daniel I wanted to believe in. The woman from Denver and I kept texting for a while after that. At some point, we even exchanged names, which felt strangely personal after everything else we already knew about each other. Her name was Claire. And honestly, talking to her felt less awkward than it should have. Probably because trauma removes normal social rules sometimes. We weren't strangers anymore. We were two people trying to understand the same disaster from different sides. Are you going home? She asked. I looked down at the message for a second before answering. I don't know yet. That was the truth. Because suddenly the apartment I shared with Daniel didn't feel like home anymore. Every object inside it now carried this weird second meaning I couldn't unsee. The couch where we watched movies together. The kitchen where he made coffee every morning. The bed where I slept beside him while other versions of his life existed in different cities. Nothing felt stable anymore. Then Claire sent another message. I keep thinking about something. What? He never mixed worlds unless something went wrong. I stared at that sentence for a second. And slowly, another realization settled into my chest. She was right. None of this happened because Daniel confessed. None of it happened because he wanted honesty. It happened because timing failed. I arrived early. She asked questions. Schedules overlapped. That's all. Without those small accidents, this probably could have continued for years. Maybe forever. That thought honestly scared me more than anything else. Because it meant Daniel's system actually worked. At least most of the time. Then another message appeared. Do you think he'll stop? I leaned back slowly in the seat while staring at the dashboard lights glowing softly in the dark. And after everything I'd learned that night, the answer suddenly felt obvious. No, I typed. Not because people can't change, but because Daniel didn't actually see himself as broken. That's what made the entire thing so disturbing in the end. If he'd been ashamed, maybe there would have been hope somewhere inside all of this. If he sounded guilty, confused, or emotionally devastated by what he'd done, maybe I could have convinced myself there was still a real person trapped underneath everything else. But Daniel wasn't confused. He understood himself perfectly. That's why he stayed calm. That's why he built systems instead of relationships. That's why he talked about identity like clothing people wear temporarily before becoming someone else again. And honestly, once I finally accepted that truth, something inside me stopped hurting the same way. Because I realized this wasn't my failure. It wasn't Claire's either. People like Daniel don't search for partners. They search for environments, new mirrors, new identities, new emotional worlds where they can temporarily escape themselves. And eventually, no single person is enough because the addiction was never love. It was reinvention. My phone buzzed again unexpectedly. Daniel. For a second, I just stared at his name on the screen while this weird calm settled over me. A few hours earlier, seeing his name would have immediately changed my mood. Now it just felt strange. Distant. Like hearing from someone I already lost long before tonight happened. The message finally appeared. I never wanted to hurt you. I actually closed my eyes when I read it, because I think part of him probably believed that. That's what makes people like him so dangerous. They separate intention from consequence so completely that eventually they stop seeing the damage they cause as real. I stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back. You built your life around hurting people without looking at it directly. Three dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then came back again. Finally. I hope someday you understand me better. That message honestly chilled me more than everything else combined. Not because it sounded threatening, because it sounded sincere. Even after everything, Daniel still believed the real problem was perspective, not behavior. Perspective. I looked out through the windshield again while traffic moved slowly through the city around me, and suddenly I understood why this entire relationship left me feeling emotionally exhausted for so long without fully realizing it. Nothing with him was ever fully solid. Not conversations. Not emotions. Not identity. Everything shifted depending on what version of reality he needed at the time. And eventually, loving someone like that forces you to constantly question your own instincts until you stop trusting yourself completely. That's the real damage people like Daniel leave behind. Not just heartbreak. Confusion. The kind that follows you long after they're gone. Claire texted me one final time before we stopped talking that night. What are you going to do now? I thought about that question while looking at the city outside my windshield. Then I answered honestly. I think I'm going to learn how to trust my own mind again. She reacted to the message with a heart. And weirdly enough, that small reaction felt more emotionally honest than almost anything Daniel had said to me in 3 years. I finally started the car a few minutes later and pulled out of the parking lot slowly, watching the diner disappear in my rearview mirror. I wish I could tell you there was some dramatic ending after that. That Daniel completely fell apart. That all the women confronted him together. That his entire system collapsed overnight. But honestly, life usually doesn't end that cleanly. People like Daniel survive because they know how to adapt, how to disappear, how to become someone else again. Maybe somewhere right now, there's another city and another woman listening to another carefully constructed version of his life. Maybe one day she'll discover the truth too. Or maybe she already has. But one thing I know for sure is this. The worst part of loving someone like Daniel isn't realizing they lied to you. It's realizing they were probably performing from the very beginning. And you still miss parts of them anyway.